as though there wasn't enough problems in the Russia-Ukraine war, as we're trying desperately to get to a position with the emergence of the Trump administration to try and get a negotiated settlement in the war, in the risk of escalation with the current administration allowing long-range strikes by American weapons and British and French weapons into the Russian mainland and the heartland, which we're dealing with the possibilities of escalating there. Now then, we have just in the last 36 hours or 24 hours, I guess, as an attempt on, not an attempt, an execution and an assassination of a Russian general in Moscow by the Ukrainian side, which unusually they have taken credit for it, and they didn't deny it at all. Said it was supposed to send a message to Russia. We're going to get to what that message may have been intended, and we'll see how that worked out. But there's been some additional information and the developments of where and how this war is going to be settled anyway between the primary people, and that is between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And to try and to make sense of all this and to see, kind of read between the lines about what's really going on here, we have back with us today Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran, and just all-around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
Always appreciate having you here on this because you were so tied into what's going on, and there's probably not a better analyst of combat, because given that you've led troops in high intensity combat in the past and trained a lot of other troops to do the same thing. So it's always great to have you on. And let's just jump right into this. First of all, we keep talking about that things could radically change on January 20th when the Trump administration is inaugurated into power, and I want to show folks a little bit about Trump's thinking, because sometimes we only think about things, at least in the media, in the Western media, about the strategic calculus and what's good for this side or that side. But Trump is showing his humanity side too. That one of the things that's actually motivating him on wanting to reach this end. And one of the first things he said in a speech, I guess it was a couple of days ago, he explained why he wants to end the war.
Everyone's being killed. It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II. I've had pictures of fields where bodies are lying on top of bodies. Looks like the old pictures of the Civil War, where just bodies are all over. Just if you saw those pictures, you'd feel more strongly about it. It's got to stop.
So it's not just about the deal or what he can strike, but he seems genuinely motivated by the huge number of people that are dying in this.
Well, the good thing is you're not going to hear a stupid statement from President Trump like the ones we've gotten from people like Lindsey Graham, who talk about why we should celebrate the deaths of Russians. Perhaps at some point the true figures will also be revealed to President Trump. Because the Ukrainians have taken losses at a rate of about 6 to 7 for every one Russian soldier that was lost. So these numbers are outrageous, and these piles of dead that he's pointing to are overwhelmingly Ukrainian.
And when you're talking about what you want to do and why you want to bring something to an end, it just seems to me that there's insufficiently small recognition of the profound price that's being paid by the Ukrainian people. And so many people, like the Lindsey Grahams, like the Jack Keanes, like the General Hodges, they almost seem oblivious to this. I remember some really painful stories from earlier this year when Lindsey Graham went to Ukraine and was cheerleading them on and saying, yeah, bring more troops in, lower the recruiting age. Apparently, some in the current administration are still trying to pressure Kiev into doing that, oblivious to the cost to them and what this is going to mean going forward. Why do you suppose we don't care anything at all, at least on the official level, about the casualties on the Ukraine side?
Well, Zelensky's meat grinder seems to appeal to a lot of people in Washington, who obviously have no sense whatsoever of what's happening on the battlefield. They don't understand the suffering in war. They don't understand that once you have an advantage over your enemy, which is what the Russians have had for some time now, but particularly at the end, when the front collapses and people are running for their lives, there's no sense of just how much damage you can do at that point. And the Russians have I think on more than one occasion exercised a remarkable restraint, but then they've been compelled for obvious reasons to destroy what's in front of them. I mean, it's a tough position. You'll remember when I came to you after we had blasted through the Republican Guard rear detachment, a couple of things came up. One was that I called for a ceasefire, and a number of people were angry with me because they thought we should just annihilate what was left out in front of us. And there wasn't much there, as you know, Dan. And I said, no, we didn't come here to exterminate people. We didn't come here to exterminate the Iraqi military or anything else. We came here, we've won a battle. Now we need to give the people that are still alive a chance to surrender. You'll remember that.
I do.
But then afterwards, once they did surrender, I also made it clear that we were going to wipe out whatever was still out there. And that's what you put together, the Armageddon strike that we launched from the artillery, because we weren't allowed to advance. But the bottom line is that, this is not a ruthless war of extermination on the Russian side. And the Russians have never wanted that. But sadly, I think there's a lot of evidence that the Ukrainians have taken that position, and we take that position, and we simply do not care what happens to the Ukrainians. They are cannon fodder for the United States, I'm afraid.
And so now then we see, as a result of this significant loss of Ukrainian life, it's having the inexorable result on the battlefield. The only result it can be is the continued and now accelerating advance of the Russians to the west, now at the gates of Pokrovsk, Vasilivka, Novoselka, even in the Kursk area, they continue to shrink that incursion. Really everywhere on the battlefield, you see Russia continues to advance. And now at an accelerating rate. So that brings the question that Trump was also asking at press conference yesterday: are you going to, quote, give away land in exchange for peace? Here's what he said.
Do you believe that Ukraine should cede territory to Russia?
Well, I'm going to let you know that after I have my first meeting. But a lot of that territory, when you look at what's happened to those, I mean, there are cities that there's not a building standing. It's a demolition site. There's not a building standing. So people can't go back to those cities. There's nothing there. It's just rubble.
And I want to look at the premise of the question itself, because I hear it a lot. The impression that there's all this territory that we have in our hands, and we meaning the collective West and Ukraine, and that is Trump going to come in and just hand it over to Russia? I think that that's not the right discussion of even what's at stake here. And I'd like your view on that. The specific question is, does Trump have land to hand over to Ukraine, or is the Russians going to just take whatever they want on the battlefield, and that's just the reality?
Remember, there are preconditions to the talks from the Russian side. First and foremost, whoever comes to the talks, whether it is Donald Trump or his representatives, have to acknowledge that Ukraine will be neutral. There will be no joining of NATO now or ever. I think probably the Russians are less concerned about NATO the more they see of it, given how poorly the weapon systems have performed, and also the fact that, frankly, in Europe, there is absolutely no appetite whatsoever for war in Ukraine against Russia. But nevertheless, they're going to stand by that first requirement. Ukraine must be neutral. Secondly, that the legitimate control/ownership of the oblasts that have been seized inside Ukraine, which are populated by Russians, as well as Crimea, which already voted itself legally into Russia, these must be recognized as Russian territory. Now, those are the two basic requirements. If we're not willing to do that, it doesn't really make much difference what anyone says, because the Russians are not going to listen to us. I think that's very important. And the second thing, though, that I think that we need to keep in mind is solving the border issue is a matter for Russians and Ukrainians. I know that President Trump thinks of the United States as the great superpower that will come in and divide this child. And he'll sign off on whatever he thinks is appropriate. But the truth is, what we really need to do is simply suspend aid immediately, military aid to Ukraine, and withdraw all of our forces. And you'll have people around Trump say, oh, we can't do that. We're giving up a bargaining chip. Well, that's not really much of a bargaining chip, because as long as we persist in those areas, the Russians are going to move west. And there are talks right now inside the general staff that if a settlement is not reached along the lines that I just described, well, then they march west. And that means all the way to the Polish border and the Romanian border. If that's what we want, then by all means, continue to reject neutrality and the legitimate control of the territories in eastern Ukraine that are populated with Russians to Russia.
And do you think that they can actually make good on that? When you look at how long, for example, it's taken to get even up to Pokrovsk, how long it took to get Avdiivka, Vuhledar, et cetera, over a year in the case of Vuhledar, does Russia have the capacity to make good on that threat?
I think they can, absolutely, because there's nothing west of the Dnieper River to stop them. But is that something we even want to contemplate? It doesn't make any sense. And it's not something the Russians want, because they know the people living west of the Dnieper River are Ukrainians. Right. They don't want to rule Ukrainians. That's like, taking over a country whose entire population is hostile to you, and then you deal with all the consequences. But no, I think the Russians are quite serious. I think we have failed for the last 3 years, Dan, to take them seriously. Yeah, and we continue. I listened to someone earlier today talk about a statement from this former ambassador McFaul suggesting that Ukraine can still win.
Oh my
God.
Unless
he's smoking crack, there's no excuse for a remarkably stupid comment like that. There is no chance whatsoever. Ukraine is destroyed. Can we rescue Ukraine as a nation state at all is the question now.
Yeah, and that still is very much up and grab, because I think, as you said, if we don't agree when the Trump administration comes in to those terms at the beginning, whether quickly or later, I think that Russia does have the capacity to do that, and we actually have looked at in recent episodes here at the defensive fortifications and why Pokrovsk is so important, because all of these defensive fortifications that have been chewed through, most of which were built in the 2014 and before period, and there's just not much on the other side of Pokrovsk that Russia has been chewing through, and it's entirely conceivable that they could make much more rapid progress on the other side of that if we keep going that far. But interesting, we a lot in the West love to characterize Vladimir Putin as Adolf Hitler, this purely evil person. He's used those terms in the West all the time about Putin. But when you listen to him talking about what the consequence for Ukraine is, it almost seems like he cares about the people.
If they reduce the mobilization age, lower the service age, it will not change the situation in the battlefield like it didn't for Hitler's Germany. But it will be one in a series of crimes they commit against their people. It doesn't protect the interests of the Ukrainian people. Such a decision would only protect the decisions of those who give decisions from abroad. That is the only motivation. Young boys will be herded and sent to be slaughtered. We saw how they are being caught in the streets like stray dogs and sent to face the bullets.
I think you've mentioned before that Putin, while he's against the government in Kiev, that he's not against the people in Ukraine. And as you have rightly pointed out many times, he's been very restrained when it comes to the damage he could have inflicted on the civil population throughout this war, and still has not done it, limiting his targets primarily to military installations or energy infrastructure, which is needed to maybe make their capability to conduct war continue on, to try to degrade that here. But one thing that in the U.S., one of many, I suppose, not only is Vladimir Putin Hitler, but also anything any Russian ever says is untrue. So just categorically just disbelieve anything. And the latest of that is Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, said overnight that he revealed, apparently for the first time, that he's actually put a number on it. He said the number of irretrievable losses for the Ukraine side is now over 1 million. That's killed and disabled to where they can no longer return to the battlefield. And that is a staggering number so far. And I just want to ask you, first of all, do you think that number is close to being right, or is it just Russian propaganda?
I think he's probably underestimating it. I think there are probably 1.4 to 1.5 million that fall into that category that you just described. President Trump talked about this as the worst we've seen since World War II, and he was correct in that sense. But this is more like a World War I battlefield. And again, we go back to this understanding that once you have networked, integrated all of the overhead surveillance, manned, unmanned, sensors from the ground all the way into space, with all of your strike systems, and the Russians historically have always had enormous numbers of strike systems. I'm talking about anything beyond line of sight. Once those are networked, you make it impossible for your enemy, unless the enemy has substantial air and missile defenses, to really move. It makes maneuver almost impossible. That's what the Russians have done in Ukraine. But you have to strip away that air and missile defense, which the Russians have done. We need to understand that. When that battlefield reveals itself and you don't have the capacity to defend yourselves against the air and missile threats that are multiplied by many, many times, 1,000 times what we've seen in the past, then you are in the position the Ukrainians are now. That means that your opponent can maneuver. Your opponent can appear wherever he likes. Your opponent can attack you wherever he likes, but you have no response. Because if you try to respond, if you leave your hole in the ground, or you leave wherever you are concealed, you're going to be destroyed. You know, the Russians, by the way, when Bonaparte faced the Russians finally in Russia itself, he was shocked that the Russians had more artillery than he did, because one of the secrets to his success was extraordinarily well-trained, accurate, and large quantities of artillery. So this is an age-old Russian plus. And that's also what the Germans and their allies found in Russia as the war dragged on. So that's no mystery. And that's not going to change. So hopefully, you know, people will listen to President Trump and understand just how terrible the lethality of this battlefield is. But I don't think they will. I think this is going to go on and on and on until 20 January. And then the real question is, can he rein in this rogue deep state, which consists largely of the intelligence communities and their supporters, and especially on the Hill? Can he rein it in? If he can't rein it in, can he break it and make it responsive to national command authority? I don't know.
Yeah, and man, almost as if right on cue. That was actually where we were going to go next in this, because in light of all the things that you just said there, we have to assume, and I think it's a safe assumption, that behind the headlines and behind the public statements, that whether in the Pentagon or whether in Whitehall or in the halls of power in France, that they're aware of what's actually going on the ground. They can see things. They're aware of these. They know that whatever the real number of Ukraine losses are, I mean, they have to know all that. So they have to know, just no matter what they want to say or what they wish would happen, that there are constraints and limitations physically on the battlefield. And yet, here we have Keir Starmer just yesterday addressing the war in Ukraine, almost completely oblivious to what you just said. But here's the important thing. It's not just his words, but his actions that go along with them.
Absolutely right to say it's a critical period for Ukraine. And I've been here with key NATO allies this morning having a discussion about Ukraine. We're on HMS Iron Duke here, which is in Estonia. We've got troops up the road who are integrated as part of our NATO response. The collective view is very clear. We must put Ukraine in the strongest possible position. That means we've got to make sure they have the capability they need, the training they need, the funding that they need, and we must support Ukraine in what they're doing. This is an act of aggression by Russia that's been going on for a very, very long time, so we must stand with Ukraine at this critical period.
Are you comfortable with the assassination, though?
Well, as I say, we must stand with Ukraine. I think that's a developing situation, but this morning's discussion was very clear about the strategic need.
So he referenced there, he was asked about the assassination of the Russian general. We're going to get to that in just a second. But let me stick with that first part there, because he mentioned that he was at a NATO meeting where he's talking about this continuing on, and we have to keep going on. But everybody knows, even if you ignore the battlefield, that Donald Trump's coming in unequivocally and emphatically saying, as we just showed from yesterday, we're going to find a negotiated settlement. So then why would the NATO and Western countries continue with this fiction as though Joe Biden is going to continue to be president? How does that work?
Well, the governments that we're discussing, like Keir Starmer's government or Olaf Scholz's government and Macron's government, are all in the hands of globalists that are committed to the open-ended, relentless war against Russia for all the reasons that we've discussed in the past. Russia presents an obstacle to the globalists that they can't get past. Russia is a national state. It has a culture that rests on the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. You begin to look at these things carefully, and clearly Russia has to be destroyed. Because what have all of these people done? Starmer is trying to destroy his own country. He's trying to accelerate immigration into the country, involving millions of people who are non-Europeans with the goal of destroying his own population. We've seen this unfold in Ireland. It's unfolding in Germany, in France, to a lesser extent in Spain, and to some extent in Italy. These governments are not going to last. Right now, Meloni can survive. There's no question about that in Italy, because she's diverged sharply from that path. But everybody else in Berlin, Paris, and London, they're scheduled for extinction. They're not going to last, Dan, and they know that. So I wouldn't put too much store in what they are saying, but I think it's another reflection of just how powerful this unelected deep state is, and the fact that it reaches over national borders into countries like Germany, France, and Great Britain.
Okay, but let's accept that they think that way, et cetera. But there's still the practical matter, and this is the part that I just don't understand. And maybe you can help illuminate this a little bit. You may want that outcome, but you know that somebody's about to come in that's going to change it diplomatically, and you see on the battlefield it will not go the way you want. So where is the value in having the fiction to go up for another month or so?
Well, if you're familiar with Noam Chomsky's Manufactured Consent, and you also are familiar with Leon Trotsky and his activity as a Bolshevik, Trotsky's quip to one of his Bolshevik lieutenants who said, "Comrade, we can't possibly say this, it's not true." And he looked at him and he said, "Comrade, paper will put up with anything you put on it." Well, we've learned that the radio, television, internet, all of these things will put up with whatever you put on it. And sadly, large numbers of people will believe it, particularly if you keep saying it over and over and over again. So, this is going to go on until it is unambiguously clear that everyone's being lied to. Things are not turning out as anticipated, and they will not continue. Now, I think that's already begun a little bit in Germany, although I think the new chancellor, this Christian Democrat, is making stupid statements about Russia. That's not going to go down well with the public, not because they love Russians, but because nobody there is interested in going to war with Russia. I saw a poll today in Poland that suggested 55% of the adult population wants nothing to do with the war against Russia. These things are facts, and at some point, facts are hard to avoid, and they're insurmountable. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to them. In this sense, President Trump is on the right side of history. I just hope that he doesn't have unrealistic expectations of what he can impose. Impose is important on so-called on the Russians or Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, because I don't think he can do that.
Okay, let's look at the other part of what Starmer said there. He was asked, and it was interesting as he was asked about the assassination of the Russian general, is that it apparently caught him off guard. I don't know how it would have. And he was like trying to figure out how he can say something without saying anything. And that's exactly what he said. Well, we'll have to figure that out later. Anyway, back to what I was saying here. But what do you make of this assassination attempt? Because this also fits in the pattern of nobody knows that the war can't be won more than the Ukrainian people behind the scenes and off camera. And yet they're not only have been trying to get this long range weapon systems used by the United States and France and Britain to hit targets in Russia. And then this most recent attempt at a provocation to assassinate somebody in Russia. And according to the Wall Street Journal this morning, that's supposed to send a message to Russia. That's supposed to make them quake that nobody is safe, etc. What do you make of the real intent behind this?
Well, we have to know a little bit more about General Kirillov, and I did not. And for the last 24 to 36 hours, I've been digging, and several of my sources have finally come forward and explained the rationale behind this assassination. At the start of the special military operation, General Kirillov was adamant that the various biolabs inside Ukraine that we had helped set up and finance be seized as soon as possible. Now, there were a total in Ukraine of 46 biolabs that the Russians eventually found. These biolabs were engaged in developing bioweapons. They were looking at DNA and genetics to try and formulate a weapon that could be used against Russia that would kill only Russians. Now, I don't know how far they got, because if you look at Ukrainian DNA, which is different from Russian DNA, it's not radically different, but there are differences. If you look at that and then you look at Russian DNA, I don't know how they would have managed to avoid killing large numbers of Ukrainians. But then again, given the acute lack of interest in humanity in Washington, it may not have mattered to the people that were behind this. But he was the first to say, we've got to get into those biolabs, find out what they were doing. And I'm only talking about one aspect of the horrific things being done in those laboratories, where they found body parts that had been removed and were going to be resold, and a number of experiments that I don't want to go into. But the point is, there were 46 of them, and ultimately the Russians, once they found out what they hoped was not true, they then destroyed these. They've obviously held on to much of the evidence, and a lot of this evidence leads back on a trail all the way to Washington, D.C., and some key political figures who have a hand in this and have actually invested in it. It's pretty frightening. In addition, he also identified the Kharkov Institute, which was the one place in Ukraine that was capable of developing a nuclear weapon. Now, how much Ukrainians were able to rescue from Kharkov before it was overrun by the Russians, but the Russians did get into it. They did get to the Kharkov Institute, and they discovered that there were efforts underway to create a suitcase nuclear weapon. We've heard lots about this in the media. Apparently, that was actually underway. Kirillov was behind all of the discoveries. He was the one who was tracking closely with Russian intelligence what we and the Ukrainians were doing in Ukraine. The military ultimately went in, at first was skeptical, but then when they began to discover the accuracy of his assertions, they went into all of them. And they've eliminated the labs, and they have shut down this thing in Kharkov Institute. But when you understand that, then you can understand why this criminal Ukrainian state, this organized crime state we pretend is a democracy or some other nonsensical thing, wants to kill the man, because he revealed what they were up to. And that's something they didn't want anyone to discover.
And we've talked about that. I think just yesterday on our show, we showed the headline from online right now at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, I think they call it, where we admit there were 46 labs in the that the United States had funded. It's in. So this is not conspiracy theory kind of stuff. They, in fact, we still to this day admit, yeah, the stuff was there. And then they tried to shift it away and say, but, it was just a Russian propaganda misinformation campaign, because really everything was really cool. Now, there's out today an additional, or maybe it was yesterday, from the UK. Michael Clark went on Sky News to try and explain a different reason why Kirill may have been taken out.
Kirillov was in charge of CBN, chemical, biological, nuclear, by which we mean radiological. And he was in charge of the protection of Russian troops from those elements, chemical, biological, radiological. But his role went far beyond that. His actual behavior was that he was involved in the planning of chemical warfare in Syria. And he's had a great deal to do, and that's what the British government think, with chemical warfare all the way around the front in Ukraine. The K-51 gas grenade, a grenade that carries CS gas, but in some cases in lethal concentrations, is ubiquitous all along the front. It's used all the time. And there have been traces of sarin and cyanide in a number of chemical attacks. The Ukrainians have said that about 5,000 attacks have taken place. Western analysts say that might be a slight exaggeration, but the number is more or less credible.
It just seems a little bit unusual and skeptical when you're going to claim that there have been 5,000. Yeah, there's that Ditra headline that Gary was showing yesterday, that there are 5,000 chemical weapon strikes used by Russia. We've never heard about it until after this assassination. What do you make of this charge?
Well, first of all, I think we've learned by now not to believe much that the Ukrainians say. I mean, we're back to the ghost of Kiev. And I think the Russians have been extraordinarily careful. Putin certainly has. I see no evidence for what they're arguing. Now, could someone have done something somewhere along the, 800-mile front? I have no idea. But I think that Ukrainian assertion is ridiculous. I think, on the other hand, what I've told you is quite true. And this is an old Bolshevik trick. If you are doing something that is horrific and heinous, accuse your opponent of doing it and use that as the justification for what you're doing. That's an old Bolshevik approach. It's nothing new in any of that. So I would take this with a grain of salt and go back to the original assertion. Were there any biolabs being established along the border of Ukraine by Russians for use against Ukrainians? Answer, no. Well, then why would the Russians then suddenly turn to the use of chemical or biological weapons against Ukrainians? They haven't. And that's not the sort of thing that the Russians are going to do in proximity to their own territory.
Yeah.
But this is a mountain of lies that's being built, and the mountain has to be dismantled. It will be, but not quickly. Now, I also noted something else. He talked about Syria, and you and I have exchanged comments on this. You know Ted Postel, and we know what a number of British observers have said, that MI6 staged 2 false flag events, both of which attracted missiles that were fired at Syria at President Trump's insistence. President Trump needs to understand that he hasn't had much truth from anybody in the intelligence community. He hasn't had much truth from anybody at the top of the Department of Defense. If he doesn't have truth tellers there, he's in a lot of trouble, because the people that are at the top of those organizations have a lot of people under them that are not telling them the truth. So we don't know what's going to happen after 20 January. I have always said, and I repeat this with all sincerity, Donald Trump is a man of good intentions and he is sincere, but he is frequently misinformed or simply lied to, boldface, lie. And that's a problem that exists now, and it's going to exist in the future. He's going to have to deal with that. And I hope that the people he's appointed are going to be able to tell him the truth.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm really hopeful that Tulsi Gabbard gets that DNI position, because that will put somebody that's willing to tell the truth in a key position. We'll have to see if that works out there too.
Well, I think it's important that you mention that, because no one on the Hill has raised objections to this Ratcliffe individual who they're going to put in charge of the CIA because he's one of their own. Tulsi Gabbard isn't, and they're doing everything in their power to destroy her before she ever gets to the hearing. And I'm sure they'll take every opportunity to destroy her at the hearing, because she's inclined, God forbid, to tell the truth.
Right.
And we need a good dose of truth. We haven't had much truth for the last 30 years.
Indeed, we have not. And that's one of the reasons I'm so hopeful, and why we are so much a big fan of hers here on this show. I want to look at one other aspect, because we're going to shift actually to Syria here in just a second. But I want to look at one thing that we haven't talked much about, the Russian reaction to this so far. Let's see. Dmitry Medvedev actually came out and said, listen, there is going to be a response to this, those who killed Kirillov. And he specifically says, we need to do everything to destroy the customers who are in Kiev. These customers are known. This is the military political leadership of Ukraine. Now, Medvedev is well known and famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, for saying lots of hyperbolic things, many of which don't come true. But he's also talked about many things that have come to pass. Do you think that Putin, as restrained as he's been in some areas, will allow this assassination in the capital, not far from the Kremlin, to go without response? And if not, what do you think may come from Russia?
I can't predict what the response will be, only that there will undoubtedly be a response. This is not going to pass unnoticed or unpunished, particularly at this point in time when Ukraine is weaker than it's ever been. In fact, I don't know that the Ukrainian nation state per se even exists anymore. The military is fragmented and disintegrated. So I'm sure something will be done. I can't predict it. But again, you've got to be careful. Medvedev has always been, as you say, very hyperbolic. Remember that President Putin, as the head of state of Russia, must first and foremost think of what's in Russia's larger interest. He's done very well in that capacity, in my judgment, because he's kept Russia out of a major conflict with us, and for that matter, with NATO. He's avoided it. I think he wants to continue to avoid it, as any sane person would. Hopefully, when President Trump takes the reins of power, he will be able to cooperate with Putin in avoiding that collision that would be catastrophic for all of us.